I signed away a year of my life at a desk made of black oak with a quill that cost more than my father's bakery, while the Alpha King watched me from across the room as though I were a contract clause he hadn't finished reading. "You understand the terms met," he said. Not a question. The King of Highmoor did not, I would learn, deal much in questions. 1 year, a marriage in name only. You will live at the keep, you will be seen at my side when the court requires it, and you will be to all appearances my Luna. We will share no bed, no affection, and no expectations. At the year's end, the marriage is quietly annulled. You walk away with the sum we agreed, and we never trouble each other again. His gray eyes were cool and even. Is that acceptable? It's acceptable, I said. It was more than acceptable. It was a miracle dressed up as a humiliation, and I'd have signed it in blood. I should explain how a baker's daughter ended up signing a marriage contract with a king, because it was not romance. It was arithmetic. My name is Tessa. My father was the best bread baker in the lower town and the worst manager of money in the entire kingdom. A warm and generous man who gave loaves away to anyone hungrier than us, which was nearly everyone, and who died owing more than I had ever seen, written down in one place. He left me 2 things, a bakery I loved more than my own life, the warm stone heart of every good memory I owned, and a debt against it large enough that the lenders had set a date, and the date was close, and on it, I would lose the bakery, the ovens, the little flat above it, the last warm place that still smelled of him. You have to understand what the bakery was, or none of the rest of it makes sense. It was not just a shop. It was where my father had taught me to knead before I could read his big flour-dusted hands over my small ones. It was the table where we'd eaten every meal of my childhood, the ovens whose warmth I'd fallen asleep against the window where he'd set the day's first loaf to cool, so the smell would pull the whole street awake. After my mother died, it had been the 2 of us and the ovens, and after he died, it had been just me and the ovens. And the smell of him still in the walls, and the thought of strangers tearing it down or selling it off felt less like losing a building than like losing him a second time completely. I had spent a year trying everything longer hours, cheaper flour selling what little we owned, begging the lenders for time. There was nothing left to try. The date was 3 weeks off when the king's summons came, and then the summons came. Not to me, to half the eligible commoners in Highmoor quietly through discreet channels, because the king had a problem of his own, and it turned out our 2 problems fit together like a key in a lock. The problem was the law, an old one from the founding of Highmoor, the Accord of the Moon, they called it, which held that no wolf could hold the throne unmated past his 35th year on the reasoning that an alpha without a Luna was an alpha without a check on his power, and the founders had feared a king with no one to answer to. King Dain of Highmoor was about to turn 35. He had no mate, and the law was clear: take a Luna, or forfeit the throne to a challenge. He did not want a Luna. That much was plain to the whole kingdom. What he wanted, even less, I gathered, was the alternative. The law had nearly forced on him a real marriage to a daughter of one of the great houses, a political match that would have handed half his power to whichever noble family won the bidding, with a wife he hadn't chosen, and a web of obligations he couldn't cut. The great houses had been circling for months, each pushing its daughter, and the king, cornered, refusing to be owned, had found a third door. He would satisfy the letter of the law without surrendering an inch of himself. He would marry. But he would marry a nobody, a commoner with no house, no faction, no claim, no ambitions beyond a sum of money on a 1-year contract with a clean annulment at the end. The law would be satisfied. No great house would gain a foothold, and the king would stay exactly as alone and as unowned as he intended to remain. It was cold, it was clever, and it was for a baker's daughter about to lose everything the answer to a prayer. So I put on the only good dress I owned, and I went to the keep, and I sat across a black oak desk from the most powerful man in the kingdom, and where the other candidates had simpered or trembled or tried to charm, I did the thing that he told me much later made him choose me. I read the contract. All of it, slowly. I asked 3 sharp questions about the annulment clause and one about what would happen to my payment if he broke the terms, and I negotiated the sum upward by a third, and I did not smile at him once. I remember the exact moment I saw I'd surprised him. I'd reached the clause about my comportment as Luna, a vague ominous paragraph about conducting myself in a manner befitting the crown, and I'd looked up and said plainly, "This could mean anything. As written, you could decide a year from now that I comported myself poorly, void my payment, and put me out with nothing. I want it specific, or I want it struck." A clerk had made a small scandalized sound, and the king, who I think had expected a frightened girl grateful for any terms at all, had gone very still and then said slowly, "Strike it," to the clerk, without taking his eyes off me, like a man recalculating something. "You're not afraid of me," he observed when it was done. "I'm afraid of the lenders taking my father's bakery," I said. "After that, Your Majesty, there's not much fear left over for anything else." Something flickered across that cold face, not warmth, but a kind of recognition, the look of one practical person identifying another. "Good," he said. "Feelings would complicate this. You have none toward me, and I have none toward you, and that is precisely why it will work." He pushed the contract toward me. "A year of pretending Tessa, that's all. We are both very lucky that neither of us wants anything real." I signed. The quill scratched and it was done, and a baker's daughter became on paper the Luna of Highmoor. I want to be honest with you because you'll see how funny it is later. I believed him completely. I believed myself completely. I was a sensible woman with a sensible problem and a sensible solution, marrying a cold king for a year to save a bakery, and the very best thing about the whole arrangement, the thing that made it safe, was that there were no feelings anywhere in it, and there never would be. We were married 3 days later in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes before a court that did not believe it, and a king who did not look at me. I wore the same good dress. There were vows, old ones, the proper words of the accord, and we spoke them to the air over each other's shoulders, 2 strangers reciting a script, and when it was done, a priest declared us mated under the moon, and the court applauded with the thin politeness of people who all knew exactly what they were watching. I remember thinking how strange it was that the most binding words in the kingdom could be spoken by 2 people who meant none of them. I remember Lady Corwin's face cold and assessing in the second row, and I remember that Dain, at the one moment the ceremony required him to take my hand, had done so with a careful impersonal correctness, and that his hand had been warmer than I expected, and that I had been annoyed at myself for noticing. And that night alone in the enormous cold guest chambers of my new husband's keep, I unpacked the one thing I'd brought from home that wasn't clothes. My father's recipe book, soft with use, smelling of flour and honey and him. I made honey cakes the next morning. His recipe, my father's, I mean. The cakes were my father's, though they would come to mean something else entirely. I made them because I didn't know what else to do with myself in a strange, cold keep, and because making them made the place smell, for a moment, like somewhere I belonged. I left a plate of them in the great hall, meaning nothing by it, and went back to my rooms. That evening, a servant returned the plate. Empty. I thought nothing of it. I was sensible. There were no feelings anywhere in this arrangement. I really did believe that. Here's the trouble with pretending to be married to someone: you have to actually be near them. And being near someone day after day is how feelings get in, whether you've signed a contract against them or not. The first weeks were stiff and transactional, exactly as designed. Dain and I lived largely separate lives. In the great cold keep, he had a kingdom to run, and I had, to my surprise, very little to do, which is its own particular torment for a woman who'd worked since she could walk. We appeared together when the court required at feasts, at audiences, the king and his new Luna cool and correct and entirely false performing a marriage neither of us felt. In private, we were polite strangers who happened to share a roof. It was working precisely as the contract intended. And then slowly, it stopped working that way, and it was my own fault, because I couldn't seem to stop being myself. It started with the honey cakes. The empty plate had become, without either of us discussing it, a thing. I made them, I left them, they vanished. So one morning, I simply brought a plate to the small study where he took his early counsel, set it down at his elbow without a word, and turned to go. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "I like baking. The kitchens let me use the ovens before dawn. It's the only part of the day that feels like mine." I shrugged. "And someone's eating them." A pause. "They're very good," the King of Highmoor admitted, with the reluctance of a man confessing a weakness. "My mother was a baker when I was a boy before. They taste like that." It was nothing. It was the first human thing he had ever said to me, and I made the great mistake right there of being kind about it, of saying lightly, "Then you'll have to suffer through them all year, won't you?" instead of bowing and leaving, and he made the answering mistake of almost very nearly smiling, and that was the first crack. After that, he let me linger sometimes in the early mornings while he read his dispatches, and I left my cakes, and we talked small things at first, the weather, the keep, then larger ones, and I discovered that the cold king was not cold at all underneath. He was guarded, which is a different thing entirely, and a thing I understood, having spent a year guarding my own grief behind a shop counter. He had built the walls on purpose, the way you do when you've decided that a king who feels things can be made to bleed through them. And the cracks in those walls when they came were funny and dry and unexpectedly gentle. And I started, God help me. I started to look forward to the mornings. I learned things about my contract husband that the contract had not mentioned, that he was unfailingly fair to his servants and remembered all their names, that he sat up too late with the kingdom's problems and slept too little, that he had loved his mother and lost her young, and that the founding law forcing him to marry had felt to him like one more powerful thing reaching for the handle of his life, and that the contract with me had been his way of refusing, not coldness exactly, but a man cornered choosing the one door that let him stay free. I understood that. I'd have done the same. There was an evening that I think of as the real beginning, though. Neither of us called it anything at the time. A petitioner's child had taken ill in the lower town, and Dain, who I'd thought of as a cold administrator of a cold keep, had gone himself at night with the keep's healer because the family was too poor to send for one and too proud to ask. I only knew because I'd been awake baking and had seen him come back near dawn gray with tiredness, and I'd done the thing I do, which is feed people who look like they need it, and put a plate of warm cakes and a cup of strong tea in front of him without a word. And he'd looked at the cakes and then at me and said very quietly, "The child will live." Not thank you. Just telling me the way you tell the one person in the house who would understand why it mattered. And I'd said, "Good," and meant it with my whole chest. And we'd sat in the dawn kitchen, not talking, and something had shifted that no contract had a clause for. And he learned things about me, that I talked to the ovens, that I gave away food when I shouldn't, an incurable habit inherited from a father who'd done the same and died poor for it, that I missed my bakery like a limb, and that I'd told him about it one morning and then had to turn away and busy myself with the kettle because I'd surprised myself by nearly crying, that I was funny when I forgot to be careful, and that I forgot to be careful more and more around him. He'd started, I noticed, saving up dry little observations to tell me about a pompous lord, about a ridiculous diplomatic letter, the way you save up things to tell a particular person, because their laugh is the one you want. I noticed it and I filed it under, "We have become friends," because that was a safe place to file it, and I needed somewhere safe to put the warmth that kept leaking into our sensible arrangement. We did not talk about feelings. That was the rule, and we both clung to it because I told myself there were no feelings to talk about. I had simply come to like my contract husband the way you might come to like a difficult colleague. That was all. It was sensible. It was fine. There were two complications I should mention because they mattered later. The first was Lady Corwin. She was the daughter of the greatest of the great houses, the woman who had been most certain she would be, made the king's real Luna before he found his clever third door, and she had not forgiven the baker's daughter for occupying the place she'd wanted. She watched me at court with a cold measuring smile, and I caught her more than once watching Dain and me, too closely looking for the seams in our marriage. I realized, looking for proof that it was the fraud she suspected it was. A marriage entered into purely to evade the law if she could prove it would void the king's compliance with the accord entirely, would hand the throne straight to a challenge, and very possibly to her father. I knew she was hunting for it. I learned to be careful around her, which was easy, because around Lady Corwin, I never once forgot the marriage was fake. The second complication was Lord Emrys. He arrived at midsummer, an envoy from the southern Pax, and he was everything. Dain was not warm where Dain was guarded, easy where Dain was careful, a tall, laughing man who wore his charm openly and spent it freely. He was kind to me from the first in the uncomplicated way of a man who has never had to build a single wall, and he made me laugh. Small laughs at first at his terrible jokes and his outrageous stories, and I thought nothing of it because he was just a charming visitor, and I was a married woman, even if only on paper. I'll say this plainly because it matters. I was never tempted by Emrys. He was lovely and easy, and not for one moment did my heart do for him what it had started doing traitorously for my cold contract husband. But Emrys was safe to enjoy precisely because there was nothing real there laughing with him, cost me nothing, risked nothing. And after weeks of carefully not feeling things around Dain, it was a relief to simply be light with someone. I did not notice those first weeks of Emrys's visit that the king had begun to watch me when I laughed at another man's jokes. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Dain began to find reasons to attend the long diplomatic dinners he usually delegated. He grew shorter with Emrys than the man's easy warmth deserved. One evening, when Emrys had walked me back from the gardens talking and laughing the whole way, I'd found Dain waiting in the corridor with a dispatch he claimed needed my opinion on a matter of southern grain tariffs at 10 o'clock at night, and I thought it odd and thought no more of it. I did not see the way his jaw tightened when the southern envoy made his contract wife smile. I did not see the cold, careful king growing a degree colder and more careful with each passing day of Emrys's visit, like a man holding something down with both hands. I did not notice. I was sensible. There were no feelings anywhere in this arrangement. I was about to find out how wrong I was, and so much to his horror was the king. It happened at the midsummer feast in front of the entire court, and it happened because Lord Emrys told me a story about a goat. I cannot even remember the story now, something absurd from his travels, a diplomatic incident involving a prize goat and a foreign ambassador and a tablecloth. But he told it the way he told everything, with his whole face, building it and building it. And I had had a little wine, and the keep had felt less cold lately, and I was happy in a way I hadn't let myself be since my father died. And when he reached the end of the story, I laughed. Really laughed, head back, helpless, delighted, the kind of laugh that takes you by surprise and shakes your whole body, the kind of laugh I had not laughed since before the lenders set their date. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere under all your careful grief and announces that you are, despite everything, still alive. It rang across the hall. People turned, and I didn't care because it felt wonderful, and Emrys was grinning at having earned it, and for one bright, unguarded moment, the whole world was warm. And then the king was there. I didn't see him cross the hall. One moment, Emrys and I stood laughing, and the next, the Alpha King of Highmoor was simply between us, placing himself with the turn of his shoulder squarely between his Luna and the laughing envoy, and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. The court went quiet, the way a forest goes quiet. And Dain looked at Lord Emrys with an expression I had never seen on his guarded face, an expression that had nothing guarded about it at all, and said in a voice low and rough and absolutely unmistakable, "You're in my seat, Emrys." It was not Emrys's seat. There was no seat. Emrys had been standing. Everyone in that hall understood instantly that the king had not crossed the room about a chair, that the king had crossed the room because another man had made his wife laugh, and that the most controlled wolf in the kingdom had for one naked moment lost his control entirely. The possessiveness came off him in waves. It was the furthest thing imaginable from a man performing a contract marriage. It was a man who could not stand physically, could not stand to watch someone else draw that laugh from the woman beside him. And I watched the exact moment Dain realized what he'd done. I watched it cross his face, the dawning horror, the understanding, arriving a half-second too late, the way you understand you've stepped off a ledge only once you're already falling. He had crossed a crowded hall in a jealous rage over a fake wife. He had forgotten for one catastrophic moment that it was fake, and now he stood there with the truth of it written all over him in front of 300 wolves and one very interested Lady Corwin, and he could not take it back, because the whole court had seen, and worst of all, I had seen, and we both knew that you do not feel what he had just so obviously felt about a contract. The silence stretched unbearable. Emerus, no fool, murmured something gracious about mistaking the arrangements and withdrew with a small bow and a glance at me that was almost sympathy. The court slowly returned to its noise, and the King of Highmoor stood beside me, rigid, his jaw working, refusing to look at me, a man who had just accidentally shown his entire hand and did not know how to pick the cards back up. I should tell you what that jealousy did to me, because it was not what I expected. I had braced in the half-second before he reached us for embarrassment for the second-hand shame of a husband making a scene. But that was not what happened in me at all. When the King of Highmoor crossed that hall because another man had made me laugh, something in my chest had soared. Some traitorous, delighted, terrified thing had unfurled and sung. He can't bear it. He can't bear to watch someone else make me happy, and the soaring was so much larger and so much more dangerous than embarrassment that I'd had to grip the edge of the table to keep my own face in order. I had felt his jealousy and been glad of it, glad all the way down, and a sensible woman in a sensible contract marriage is not glad when her fake husband gets jealous. A sensible woman feels nothing. I did not feel nothing. I felt everything all at once in the middle of a crowded feast, and it frightened me more than anything had since my father died. "Dain," I said quietly. "Don't," he said, rough, barely controlled. "Don't say anything." It was the appearance of the thing. A king cannot be seen to. It was about appearances. The court must believe the marriage is real, and you were... He stopped. Even he couldn't finish it. Even he could hear that the court must believe it's real did not explain the look on his face, or the way his hand had half risen toward me, or the 10 degrees the room had dropped. He had reached for the contract to hide behind the way we both always did, and for the first time the contract was too small to hide a single thing. It was about appearances, I repeated, carefully, giving him the door because I did not know what else to do, because my own heart was suddenly hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with appearances either. "Yes," he said desperately, "appearances." We both knew it was a lie. And standing there in the warm, bright ruins of the midsummer feast, with a laugh still dying in the air, and a court full of witnesses, and a king who had just forgotten his own contract, I understood two things at once, with the force of a door blowing open. The first was that Dain had feelings for me, real ones, the kind you cannot sign away. And the second, the one that frightened me far more, was that the reason my heart was pounding, the reason his jealousy had sent something soaring through me instead of merely embarrassing me, was that somewhere in the early mornings and the honey cakes and the cracks in his careful walls entirely, against the terms of our sensible arrangement, I had gone and fallen for him too. You would think, wouldn't you, that two people who have just discovered they have real feelings for each other would simply say so and be happy. And that would be the end of it. We did not do that. We did the opposite of that. We are wolves and we are fools, and we did the most human thing in the world, which was to take the most hopeful discovery of our lives and turn it each of us privately into a reason for despair. Because here's what I told myself in the cold days after the feast. I told myself that Dain's jealousy had been real, yes, but that real jealousy is not the same as wanting a real marriage. He was a proud man, a king, a wolf. Of course it galled him to see another man make his wife laugh in front of his court. That was pride, possessiveness, the instinct of an alpha, not love. And even if some feeling had crept in, he had been so clear from the first day at the black oak desk feelings would complicate this. He had built his whole life around refusing to be owned, refusing to want, refusing to let anything reach the handle of his life. A man like that, having accidentally felt something for his contract wife, would not welcome it. He would resent it. He would want more than ever for the year to end, and the annulment to come, and the dangerous complication of me to walk safely out of his life with her sum of money. The kindest thing I could do, the sensible thing, was to pretend the feast had never happened, count down the months. Take my payment, save the bakery, and free him from the burden of a feeling he'd never asked for. And here, I would learn much later, is what Dain told himself in those same cold days. That I had agreed to all of this for one reason and one reason only, the bakery, the debt, the sum at the end. That I was a sensible woman counting the days to my freedom and my money who had been pleasant to a difficult king, because pleasantness made a hard year easier, and who had laughed with Emrys because Emrys was the kind of warm, free, uncomplicated man a woman might actually choose, the opposite of a cold king who had bought a year of her life with a contract. That his jealousy had been not just a humiliation, but an imposition that he had no right to feel it, that he had trapped a baker's daughter into a marriage to save his throne, and had no business also wanting her heart, that the decent thing, the only honorable thing, was to let her take her money and her freedom and the warm life she deserved far away from the man who'd put her in a gilded cage to suit his own convenience. It was when he finally told me, almost unbearably tender and almost unbearably stupid, the way the two so often go together. He had taken the single most hopeful fact available to him, that I had stayed pleasant, that I had kept making the cakes, that I had not flinched from his accidental jealousy, and read every piece of it as evidence against hope. The cakes were kindness, not love. My patience was professionalism, not warmth, and the laugh at midsummer, the one that had broken his composure, he had turned into the cruelest proof of all that I was capable of, that joy just not with him, that a different kind of man could give me something he never could, that the most loving thing he could do was step aside, so a Tessa, freed of her contract, might someday laugh like that for someone she'd actually chosen. He had loved me enough to plan his own heartbreak as a gift, and I had been doing the exact same thing in the room next door with the cakes gone cold between us. So we each in love decided to protect the other from the burden of being loved. And we went colder than we'd ever been. The honey cakes stopped. The early morning stopped. We performed our marriage for the court with a new and brittle correctness, and in private we avoided each other entirely, two people aching in separate rooms of the same cold, keep each certain the other was counting the days. And then Lady Corwin made her move and forced everything into the open. She had seen at the feast exactly what everyone had seen, but where the court saw a king in love, Corwin hunting, as she'd been hunting all along, saw opportunity. Because a king genuinely in love with his Luna was inconvenient to her, but a king who had entered a fraudulent marriage purely to evade the law was finished, and the feast to her clever eye was not proof of love, but a crack she could pry at. She came to me directly in the end. She told me with her cold smile that she had assembled enough testimony from servants about the separate chambers, the suspicious convenience of the king's commoner bride, the contract she was certain existed to bring before the council, a charge that the marriage was a sham, a deliberate evasion of the accord of the moon. And if she did, the king's compliance with the law would be void. The throne would fall to challenge. Dain would lose everything. Unless she said sweetly, "The baker's daughter did the wise thing and removed herself, left quietly, voided the marriage by abandonment, in a way that let Corwin's own family step in to stabilize the throne with a proper match." She was offering me a bribe to disappear dressed as a threat. And the threat was real. She truly could destroy him. I want to tell you what I did because it is the thing I am proudest of in this whole story. I did not take the bribe, and I did not crumble, and I did not run, not the way Corwin wanted to save myself. But I also could not let her destroy him. So I did the one thing that protected Dain. Even at the cost of myself, I went to the council first before Corwin could, and I defended my marriage not as fraud, but as real. I remember standing in the doorway of that council chamber, a baker's daughter in her one good dress, with a dozen of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom, turning to look at me and being more frightened than I'd been since the lenders set their date and doing it anyway. I told them I had heard a rumor that my marriage might be questioned and that I wished to speak to it plainly before anyone else spoke for me. And then I lied with my whole heart in a way that was somehow more true than any vow I'd ever spoken. I did not say it's real and leave it there for them to doubt. I gave them the specific, helpless, unmistakable truth of it. I told them about the early mornings, about a man who remembered every servant's name, about a king who'd gone himself at night to a poor family's sickbed because they were too proud to ask. I told them my voice steadier than I felt that I had married a guarded man and discovered behind the guard the kindest one I'd ever known, and that I had not expected to love my husband and had done it anyway the way you do the most important things by accident and entirely. And I watched it land on their faces, watched the skepticism they'd walked in with dissolve because you cannot perform that kind of specificity because it wasn't a performance, whatever the contract said. I dismantled Corwin's charge before she could bring it by making the court believe in a marriage I was certain was about to end. I did it expecting nothing back. That is the part that matters. I still planned to take the annulment and go defending Dain's throne. Did not mean I believed he wanted me. It only meant I loved him enough to save him before I left. I would give him his throne and his freedom both and walk away with the bakery and let that be enough. It had to be enough. I had decided it would be. What I did not know, what I would learn that night, was that Dain had been at the back of the council chamber. He had heard the whole of it. He had heard his contract wife stand before his council and defend their marriage as real in language too specific and too aching to be performance, when she had every reason and every opportunity to take Corwin's bribe and walk away rich and free instead. He found me afterward in the cold corridor outside the chamber, and the look on his face was not guarded at all. "Why did you do that?" he said. He was breathing hard as though he'd run, though the chamber was 30 feet away. "Corwin offered you everything. Your freedom, more money than our contract, an honorable way out. All you had to do was leave and let her family take the throne, and you'd have walked away with everything you came for and more. Instead, you stood in front of my council and defended this marriage as if it were—" He stopped. "Why?" And I was tired. Tired of the cold weeks, tired of protecting him from my feelings, tired of pretending, and so I told the truth, even though I was certain it would cost me whatever dignity I had left. "Because I couldn't let her destroy you," I said. "That's all. I was always going to take the annulment, Dain. I know what I am to you. I read the contract. Remember, feelings would complicate this. You said it at the desk and you meant it, and I respected it even after I stopped being able to. But I wasn't going to walk away rich and let Corwin take your throne. I'd rather defend a marriage that's ending than watch you lose everything to a woman who only wants the crown." My voice cracked finally after weeks of holding. So I told them the truth, that I love my husband. I'll still go at the year's end. I'll take the annulment and save the bakery and get out of your way, and you'll never have to carry the inconvenience of me feeling things I agreed not to feel. But I wasn't going to let her hurt you first. You can have the truth as my parting gift. It doesn't have to mean anything to you." The King of Highmoor stared at me, and then he laughed a short, helpless, astonished laugh, the sound of a man who has been in agony over something and just discovered the agony was a misunderstanding. "You think I want the annulment," he said. "You said—" "I know what I said at that desk. I was a man who'd decided he could never afford to want anything, because wanting things is how a king gets a blade through the heart." He stepped closer, and the careful walls were simply gone, and underneath them was something I'd never let myself see full on. And then I married a baker's daughter, who talks to ovens and gives away food she can't spare and reads contracts more carefully than my own ministers, and who left me honey cakes that tasted like the one good thing in my childhood, and who looked at me across 100 cold mornings like I was a person and not a throne. And I fell so far and so fast that when another man made you laugh at midsummer, I crossed a crowded hall like a jealous fool and showed my entire kingdom a heart I'd spent 35 years hiding. He shook his head. Do you know the worst of it? It wasn't even that he touched you or stood too close. It was the laugh. That you laughed like that, free the whole of you. Head thrown back, and that I had never once made you laugh like that in all our mornings, however much I'd started trying. I sat on that dais and watched another man give you a joy I didn't know how to give, and something in me simply broke its leash. I have commanded armies without losing my composure. I lost it completely over the sound of you laughing at a story about a goat. I told myself you were counting the days. He went on rougher now, that you'd only ever wanted the bakery and the money that you'd laughed with Emrys because he was the kind of free, warm man a woman would choose, and that the decent thing was to let you go to the life you deserved instead of keeping you in a cage I'd built to save my own throne. I have spent these weeks breaking my own heart to give you a freedom I was sure you wanted. I rehearsed letting you go. I practiced the words. I told myself a man who traps a woman with a contract has forfeited the right to also want her heart. His voice cracked. And you... He stopped and looked at me as though I were something he was only now seeing properly. You were breaking yours to spare me a feeling you thought I didn't want. We stared at each other in that cold corridor as the size of it landed the weeks of agony, the careful avoidance, both of us in love, and both of us, certain the other only wanted the deal, each nobly protecting the other from a burden neither of us actually felt. We're idiots, I said. Profound idiots, he agreed. World class, there should be a contract. And then the Alpha King of Highmoor did the thing I will love him for as long as I live. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, our contract, the original, the one with the annulment clause and the sum, and the cold, careful terms, and he held it up between us, and he tore it in half, and then in half again, and he let the pieces fall to the corridor floor. There is no marriage on paper anymore, he said. There's no year, there's no annulment, and there's no sum, because I will not have you in my life as a transaction 1 hour longer. And then because he was who he was, because even now he would not assume, even now he would not be one more powerful thing, reaching for the handle of someone's life, he did not pull me in. He stood there, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, with the torn contract at his feet, and he made it mine. I'm not asking you to stay because the law needs a Luna, or because Corwin needs defeating, or because you've already saved my throne and owe me nothing and I owe you everything, he said. And I'm not trapping you. The bakery is yours, free and clear. The debt cleared, whatever you choose. That's done. It was done the moment you stood up for me in that chamber, and it has no strings. I'm asking you to stay because somewhere between the contract and midsummer, I stopped pretending, and I would like very much to be married to you, for real. No paper, no terms, no end date for the rest of my life. But it has to be your choice, a free one. Stay because you want the cold-guarded fool who fell for you, or take the bakery and your freedom and a good life far from here, and I'll defend that choice to my last breath. Your name on nothing, just you, choosing. I looked at the torn contract on the floor. I thought about the sensible woman who'd signed it, so certain the best thing about the whole arrangement was that there were no feelings anywhere in it. I thought about how wonderfully wrong she'd been. I closed the distance myself. I did it on my own 2 feet, the way I would do everything from then on by choosing it. And I took his face in my flour-rough hands and I said, "You absolute idiot. I've been making you honey cakes for 6 months. What did you think that was?" And the King of Highmoor laughed again. The real one. The unguarded one. The one I'd never managed to draw from him in all those careful mornings, and I realized with a joy that undid me that I had finally done it. I had made him laugh the way Emrys had once made me, the way you only can when the thing between you is real, And then he kissed me in a cold corridor over the pieces of a contract that had tried and failed to keep us safe from each other, and there was nothing fake about it at all. Lady Corwin denied her fraud charge by a marriage that was now embarrassingly undeniably genuine, overplayed her hand within the month, pushed too hard, schemed too openly, and was sent from court in quiet disgrace by a council that had grown very tired of her, while the baker's daughter who'd outmaneuvered her stayed exactly where she was. I almost felt sorry for her. She had spent so long hunting for the crack in our marriage that she never noticed it had healed shut while she watched. Lord Emrys, to his eternal credit, sent us a wedding gift. When we wed, again a real wedding, this time the second one, the one that counted, with a card that read, only, glad the goat story was good for something. E. I have it still framed in the bakery where it makes Dain scowl and me laugh every single time. I kept the bakery. I could never have given it up. It was my father. It was the warm stone heart of me. But I run it differently now. I bake there in the early mornings, still the honey cakes and the rest, and I give away more than I should, and Dain comes down to the lower town when the kingdom lets him, and sits in the corner of his Luna's bakery pretending to read dispatches while he eats his way through a plate of his mother's recipe, and the lower town has gotten very used to the sight of their cold king going soft over bread. It turned out, by the way, that the law had not required love at all, only a mate, only a Luna, only the check on a king's power that the founders had feared an alpha would lack without one. And here's the thing I have come to believe about that old Accord of the Moon. The founders were wiser than they knew, because a king does need someone to answer to, not a council, not a contract, but a person who will tell him the truth across a dawn kitchen, who will defend him before his own council, and then scold him for being an idiot in the same breath, who will love him enough to plan her own heartbreak as a gift, and then thank the moon be argued out of it. I am the check on Dain's power. I keep him human. The law that forced our marriage to satisfy a technicality accidentally gave him the one thing it was always actually for. We just had to stop hiding behind the paper long enough to notice. We were married on paper once to satisfy a law, a year of pretending we told ourselves, and the very best part was that neither of us wanted anything real. We were such fools. The realest thing I have ever known started as a contract I signed to save a bakery, and the moment I knew, truly knew, was the moment another man made me laugh at a feast, and a cold, careful king forgot in front of his entire court that any of it was supposed to be fake. It was never fake. I think we both knew that long before either of us was brave enough to tear up the paper and say so. And these days when he makes me laugh, and he does my guarded king more than anyone now that he's stopped guarding, I think of the version of me who sat at that black oak desk, so certain the best thing about the whole arrangement was that there were no feelings in it. I'd tell her not to worry. I'd tell her the contract was the only part that was ever going to expire. Everything else, it turned out, was permanent from the start.